Hey guys. Hello, Professor Fury here. So, this new camera just kind of floats me in as if I was coming in on a spaceship or something. Um, okay, so we're going to talk about the nature of things, De Rerum Natura by Lucretius. Lucretius is a Roman poet, and he set a whole philosophical system to poetry in Latin. It's the system of Epicurus, who is a Greek philosopher, or you might call him an early scientist. The categories, of literature and writing have shifted over the centuries many times, so they don't correspond with our own categories. Um, so Lucretius took the cosmology of Epicurus. In other words, one explanation for what makes up all things in the universe. And he set it to this beautiful poetry, this beautiful Latin poetry. It doesn't rhyme. I know a tiny bit of Latin. I know it doesn't rhyme, but it is poetry in the sense that number one, it's set in a certain rhythm. I think it's a 13 syllable line or a 12 syllable line. And number two, it uses a very beautiful and easily kind of discernible, easily digestible images. The images are beautiful, images of things like, the insides of caves with water coming down in the cool darkness, sheets being hung on a clothesline in the wind and drying, statues made of bronze with different parts of the statues wearing away and getting shinier as people touch them, the way trees grow, the way stars move. So it's poetry in the sense that he's using imagery to describe something quite beautiful and difficult, actually, because what he's really doing is his real goal, at least in the beginning part of the poem, is to describe what is the nature of the universe. Is it made up of fire? Is it made up of water? Is it a conjunction of elements? Is there like a spirit, like a kind of a spiritual essence that gives life to everything? So his theory is that Epicurus' theory, that is that the universe is made up of only two things, two types of things. And one is atoms, which in my translation, he calls them seeds, but it's often been called atoms by people who kind of comment on the poem, on your Epicurus, because they're indivisible and they're tiny and you can't see them. So they're made up of atoms and void. That's all there is. And there is no thing that exists beyond these two elements, atoms and void. Um, so it's a thoroughly materialist poem, a thoroughly materialist system. In other words, materialist in the philosophical sense, which means that um, there is only material that exists, right? Um, and it's not necessarily atheist, but in a world where there's nothing but material, gods necessarily have to be made of material as well. They can't be made out of like a some kind of magical element that you've never experienced before. So so he says a lot of funny things about gods. I mean, the poem begins with a hymn to a god, a goddess actually, Venus. Um, like a lot of Roman poets do, like a lot of classical works do, the gods are often part of the work, whether the writer is a believer or not. Um, but he says even if gods do exist, they don't care about us. I mean, they got their own problems. They're all going to die too, because anything made of material must eventually disintegrate. Because atoms, one of the many qualities of atoms, number one, they're invisible. Number two, they combine to make things. Number three, they're separated by void. Number four, they're uncuttable. Hence the word, the Greek root of the word, the etymology is a, right, which means no or non, and tum, which means to cut. So uncuttable atom, right? So they're uncuttable. And another element of atoms is that they're constantly in motion. When something's constantly in motion, it kind of bumps into other things, and eventually that thing that's kind of put together will fall apart sooner or later. So all things that are material are subject to destruction and then recreation. but not through any magical kind of process of creation by some kind of God. It's actually just the natural kind of quality of these ever-moving, indestructible, tiny things. So a lot of the book begins, well, I want to say the big part of the book, with the early chapters of the book, which are called actually books, book one, book two, book three, um, have to do with proving this. So that's the part that I really like. That's what motivated me to want to do this video, because I just got so kind of enchanted with the way he goes about proving things. And he proves these things in a poetic way. He uses imagery, and he has you think about when you observe this in the world. Think about when you observe that in the world. When you see clothes drying on a line, what can we learn from that? And I just love that you can read that and you can say, hey, that actually does prove, at least to my satisfaction, instinctively, that atoms must exist and there must be atoms out there. Yeah. So for example, he wants to prove that atoms are invisible. In other words, they're so tiny you can't see them, and yet they're there. So how do you prove that? He says, well, take a look at sailors on a ship that get blown overboard during a storm, or the power of wind that pushes against your chest if you're trying to walk into the wind. He says it's invisible, and yet there's something that's pushing you, right? So there must be some material thing that's working against you, right? And he says they are atoms are also they're moving all the time, and we can't tell when they've left something or entered something. We can't tell it directly. We can't see it with our eye, but we can infer. So, for example, he says take a shirt or a sheet made of linen, and first of all, the linen is soft, and the very reason that it's soft is because remember I said that everything's made of atoms and void. If an object has more void in it than another object, that means that the atoms are not so tightly woven together. And so there'll be more movement and more softness to that item. And an item that's hard, like a rock, number one, it's heavier, which means there's more atoms per, volume. And number two, um, it's not soft. The reason it's hard is because the atoms are so close together. It doesn't give anything. It doesn't give to your touch. So he says, oh, take a piece of cloth and it's wet. You hold it, has a certain weight, put it up on a line to dry. The sun shines, the wind blows, and a couple hours later, it's dry and it's lighter. So it's lighter because whatever matter was in it, the water, which is made up of atoms itself, is not in it anymore. It's gone. We can tell because it's dry. We can also tell because it's lighter. He says, but the whole time that it's drying, you're not seeing the water actually evaporate. So that proves how tiny these objects are, these atoms are, and yet they must exist. They must have weight. They must have some kind of um, power of some sort. The power to get things wet, the power to push you, the power, and yet, there we go. They moved on from the shirt into the sky, let's say. And so I find that it's not necessarily what you would call science, but I find it so beautiful because those images do a lot of work. One thing the image does is it's a proof, right? So it's basically a scientific proof. It says, look, observe this process, watch the water boil, watch something get dry, observe something become dry, observe how, the inside of a cave has water running down the walls, and then make a conclusion from your observations. So first of all, it's a very kind of direct, communicative way of explaining something. Very beautiful. Number two, it encourages us to look around more, because if you can prove this thing, of course, you can prove a lot of other things. So all it takes is a heightened sense of observation. And the poet, like many poets, is always persuading the reader to pay more attention to the things that the poet is talking about, whether the poet be a Shakespeare and is having you pay attention to human motivations and emotions and impulses, both evil and good, whether the poet is, a great writer like, say, Emily Dickinson, who's having you pay attention to emotions, quiet emotions that go on fully within somebody, not necessarily speaking. They're trying to heighten our awareness of the things around us. So in that sense, it's poetic. But it also goes to another interesting aspect of Epicurus, which is, what do we get out of this model of the universe that's all material? Like some people might say, wow, that's really depressing. Like there's no love, there's no spirit, there's no gods, there's no forces. You know, that's fine. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that there's nothing but material, but but the question is, a philosophical question is, what kind of ethics remain if you do that? Because if there's no God, right, there's no lawgiver. If there's no punishment after death, there's no motivation necessarily to do something good during your life. And Epicurus's solution to a lot of this is very interesting. And I don't want to go into all of that. It's actually a little too complex for me right now. I need to study it a little more deeply. But a couple basic things that Epicurus says about how do you form an ethics out of a materialist worldview is, well, if there are no gods, there's no punishment, there's no hell or heaven, then this is all there is. And so if this is all there is, you should be working and living with a certain appreciation for what's around you, including other people. And so it's, that's even the word Epicurus has become corrupted in English to mean seeking pleasure for the moment, momentary or superficial pleasure, or pleasure of food or eating rather than a deeper pleasure, let's say. Um, but that's only kind of an oversimplification of Epicurean ethics, which is, it actually grants human beings a lot more agency over the choices they make because this is what we've been given, right? So this is what we are born into. So there's an ethical part and the images actually take part in that. So as I said, first the images are a form of proof. They're proving that atoms are invisible, they move, they can move in and out of different objects. Two, they are beautiful images in themselves, and they're poetic. And three, they by using images that are available to all of us, it encourages us to live this Epicurean ethic, which is to appreciate what's around you and live for the moment. And what is the moment but a rich sensual environment? And by sensual, again, I don't mean the modern kind of English understanding of the word sensual. It usually means erotic, but sensual in the sense that appealing or having to do with a saturation of sensation, right? Paying attention to sensation, uh, things like that. And it kind of meshes with a little bit of the culture of where my family comes from, southern Italy, where I come from a family of mostly farmers that have been in southern Italy for hundreds of years, and I had the privilege of talking and living and working with the people of my grandfather's generation and even a generation before that, on the farms and things like that. And it's you can see that in a lot of these cultures, that are close to the earth, close to growing things and animals and things like that, dependent on weather. Um, there is a strong tradition of observation. You have a process, you're making something, you're making wine, you're making cheese, you're growing a plant, and it involves a lot of observation and a lot of kind of conclusions that you have to draw from those observations. And so I feel like it's very instinctively pleasing to me to read Epicurus, and I hope for you too. So that's basically it. There's a lot of other aspects to it. If you just a quick little vignette of how it was discovered, the poem was lost for more than 1,000 years. It had been a lot of the works of the Romans were written on parchment or papyrus, and so a lot of them were destroyed in various accidents in the ancient world. But one of the last pieces of the poem that survived was rolled up in these scrolls and then protected by these kind of like cylinders. But unfortunately, they were at Pompeii, and there was the eruption of Vesuvius, and they were buried, and they were rediscovered in the Renaissance by an Italian guy called Poggio, who was had worked for the Pope, and then he kind of the Pope died, and he was not politically the right person, and so he went traveling around Europe trying to make a little extra money. And at that time, early Renaissance, people were very interested in Latin, Greek, Hebrew documents that they could, feed their growing hunger for knowledge. And so you can get paid a lot of money if you found an authentic classical work. And he went around all these monasteries in Bavaria, Switzerland, places like that. And he actually found a copy of De Rerum Natura. I forget the year. It's like a 14th century, early 15th century. And he had it transcribed into Latin and it made its way into the flow of information of the Renaissance. And some people say it changed Western science. I'm always a little skeptical of, when it's the one thing that changed science, or this is the one guy who started this movement and stuff like that. In my former field of research, we studied a lot of women's writing, and you really want to give honor and respect to people who pioneered a certain type of writing or a certain type of person who wrote one of the first, magazines written by women, et cetera, like that. So the temptation is always to say the first of, or the best of, or the initiator of, and it rarely happens like that. But this book does seem to be very unique at a time when the church controlled a lot of information. This is around a little bit before Galileo, where it was very hard for scientists and astronomers to get their ideas out, to make observations. For a book to show up, which is so thoroughly materialist and so thoroughly based on observation, it almost sounds like modern science when you read it. There's one part, for example, where he says, um, well, you know, if there is such a thing as a soul, and then he goes on to make a series of proofs. But even the very premise, the very beginning, if there is such a thing as a soul, which means it's a scientific approach to everything. He doesn't just say, well, of course, if everything's material, how ridiculous would it be to think of a soul? No, he says, if there is such a thing as a soul, it must be so lightweight. It must be so ephemeral, so light that you barely notice a change in weight. Because if you look at a living body, and then a few moments later, after this person has died, their total weight hasn't changed. And if it has changed, it's changed in a way that you can't discern what has changed. So whatever was there that was keeping that person alive, and the spirit, the thinking, the vision has been gone. And he says, again, another image, a lot like when wine is exposed to air and sometimes loses its flavor, even though everything else about it still looks and smells like wine, but it's lost its bouquet, it's lost its flavor. And whatever has disappeared, whatever has evaporated, is so infinitesimal that we can't detect it. So, so that's how scientific it is. That even the existence of gods, the existence of the souls, is still a hypothesis that is up for examination and debate. And I wonder whether we are up to that. I mean, I wonder if it's challenging us in some way. Like today we are so certain that certain things are true, right? Even though, the scientific method's been around, things have been proven to work, medicine actually works, there actually is such a thing as microbes, all those questions that they had, even 300 years ago have been solved. And yet, isn't it our responsibility in every generation to kind of think again for ourselves? How do I prove this to myself? How does this belief kind of make sense to me instinctively? Since not everybody's a scientist, not everybody's a mathematician, and yet, wouldn't it be good to kind of try to formulate some of our beliefs in ways that they could be, really persuasive even to ourselves. So that's what I like about Lucretius. It's rigorous, it's beautiful, it's poetic. He's got moments in there where he's like very typical of Greek and Roman writing. where there's some younger person which he's trying to teach or mentor. Not all poetry nowadays has that. And I'm not saying it should, but sometimes you look back and you think, because another myth is the fact that everything's progressing. So our poetry must be better than their poetry. Our science is better than their science. Our sense of religion and politics is better than their sense of religion. But there's also another way to look at things as history goes on. Some things get lost, some good things get lost too. And so, you know, one thing that has been lost in poetry is this poetry as a way to inspire the young and bring them along and introduce them to things in ways that are gentle and maybe provocative, but not preachy. So that's another reason why the form that it's in, which is in a poetic form, is actually part of the beauty of the book, because there nowadays we don't frame things in such a vehicle. We don't put them in that kind of vehicle. It takes a lot of concentration to read that much poetry, but the advantage of poetry, I want to remind everybody, of course, that poetry for thousands of years was considered the number one way to communicate information. It wasn't just this optional thing like, oh yeah, my friend likes poetry, I don't. I like novels instead, or I like movies. But for centuries, millennia, and not just in the West, poetry was considered the premier vehicle for communicating cultural memory, religious memory, um, religious ideas, scientific information, mathematical information, because rhyming in cultures that don't have a technology of printing or a technology of recording is one of the best methods for kind of preserving thoughts. So rhyming and imagery is actually a technology. It's a technology of memory. It's a technology of recording, and it's a technology of teaching. So again, another great advantage of this poem called De Rerum Natura by Lucretius. I encourage you to take a look, read a couple lines here and there. Maybe, there's lots of translations online. And if you want, there's a podcast that I like. I don't know the guy, but on Spotify, there's a guy called, I think, Brian Metzger. And he has a podcast called History and Literature, and he covers tons and tons of stuff. I don't know how he has the energy to do so much material in such a good, detailed way. But he has, I think, an hour and a half on Lucretius and explains it quite beautifully. And there's also a book by Stephen Greenblatt, who is a Shakespeare scholar. And he wrote a book called The Swerve, which is one part of the physics of Epicurus, this idea that atoms are always in motion, but they actually deviate their motion a tiny bit. Otherwise, they'd all be in motion in the same kind of column and they never meet. So there must be some kind of swerve. And it's part of the physics of Epicurus, which I don't fully understand. But that book, The Swerve, explains how it was discovered, why the poem is become influential in the West, and what's special about it. And it's got great illustrations, and what a great writer Stephen Greenblatt is. So it's a real pleasure to read. Anyway, I hope I got you thinking about this and maybe inspired you to look more deeply and maybe read a little bit of Lucretius or about Lucretius. Okay, guys, take care, and thank you so much for listening.